This is All Things Voluntary, and I'm Brandon Rourke, and in this video, I'll be discussing the issue of intellectual property. Property is the basis for forming social rules. Who owns what, including the fundamental moral idea of whether a person owns his or her own body, is how we determine who gets to control some resource and what constitutes a crime. The reason we must end up determining who should properly control which resources is due to the fact that things in nature are scarce. If a resource is scarce, this means that no two people can use it at the same time or in the same way. The particular resource in question will have to be allocated to one party and, unfortunately, to the exclusion of others. A good example of this might be food. No two people can eat the same bite of food. It's a scarce resource. A consistent philosophy of property can tell us how resources ought to be allocated, which I'll discuss in another video. Without a system of property rights, deciding who should be able to use certain scarce resources and why would leave society in a state of dysfunctional chaos. Naturally, as the builder of furniture or jewelry gets to call his or her creations property, there is always the temptation of poets, writers, painters, photographers, and software programmers to call their own creations property as well. Those creations that exist independently of any physical manifestation are called intellectual property. Unfortunately, since intellectual property is constrained to the world of the abstract, it is no more possible to claim the exclusive right to some intellectual property than it is to claim to own the ability to breathe. It is logically infeasible. Obviously, this has not prevented people from attempting to defend their abstract creations. It has actually become the mark of an effective government, how well it protects intellectual property. However, these types of protection can have unfavorable consequences. Because intellectual property has no real-world manifestation, the only way to protect it is to stop people from using their own real property. For example, an alleged song may be transmitted in the form of real electronic signals over an internet cable, saved on a computer, and played on an MP3 player. In reality, all the person using it has done was to use his own property. The song only exists as a song in human minds. What the enforcer of a copyright on the song would have to do is force the computer owner to delete his own files that are physically saved on his own physical hard drive. If the defender of intellectual property wanted to be thorough, he could also force the user to somehow go through a memory modification that would cause him to forget the song. Obviously, any of this would constitute a real violation of property rights. What makes the enforcement of intellectual property even worse is the fact that it is not scarce. It is logically possible for 2 or 2 million people to be listening to the same song at the same time. Of course, they might each have to use a different means of physically listening to the song, because MP3 players and headphones are actual scarce goods. Property rights must apply to them. Now, most people living in an advanced economy understand that ideas, inventions, and other properties of the intellect are essential to the development of society. While it would be frankly impossible to live in a society with absolute enforcement of intellectual property, because this would ultimately mean that all real property claims would be virtually meaningless, there are still ways to ensure those who spend enormous resources developing pharmaceuticals or making high-budget films still reap the rewards people believe they are worth. Creators of intellectual property always remain the owners of their own minds and mouths, so on that front it will always be their choice as to how their discoveries and creations will enter the world. They also have the ability to form contracts with others regarding how the particular item carrying sensitive information, like a DVD, should be used. Ultimately, any conceivable form of control of intellectual property must translate to control of real, as in scarce, property. If the enforcement of alleged intellectual property rights is ever to be peaceful and not invade the actual property of others, it must be constrained to whatever property the creator does have the right to control in the transfer and use of ideas. This is All Things Voluntary. Thank you very much for watching.